This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I'm Associate Director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center, and I've been asked by Dr. Cedar Ranchard Nilsson, the Director of the Institute of Developing Nations here, to introduce our speaker today due to a touch of laryngitis, I believe, on Cedar's part. Otherwise, she would be doing the honors. It's a very great pleasure for me to be here as a collaborative between the Carter Center and the IDN here. We work together on many different issues, particularly issues relating to implementation of the Carter Center's programs and the nexus between practice and scholarship that the Emory community provides with IDN's assistance. And today, we are both delighted and honored to have as our guest one of Liberia's foremost human rights activists and one of the people who consistently has provided those few points of light as we look back at the difficult history that Liberia has had over recent years. And that's Councillor Samuel Kofi Woods II. Councillor Woods is currently a legal consultant with the Liberian Law Society, and most recently, before that, he was Minister of Public Works and Minister of Labor in the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf government. Prior to that, he'd spent a career in the cause of human rights, was a founder of the first national director of the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission. He was the founder of the regional human rights organization, the Foundation for International Dignity, and has won multiple international and national human rights awards, including the Reebok Award, nominee for the Kennedy Human Rights Award, and awards from the Vatican. Councillor Woods is at present traveling in the United States and Europe before returning to Liberia to help mobilize, support, and educate international partners about the Ebola crisis there. He is one of the coordinators of a newly formed Citizens Alliance to Stop Ebola, which is a group of community organizations and labor organizations and others in Liberia trying to assist in the national effort. He's very kindly agreed today to talk to us about the non-medical side of the Ebola crisis, how communities can be supportive of the effort in the short term, in the medium term, what the governance and legal human rights implications of the current state of emergency might be, and in the long term, what lessons can we learn from the recent efforts of reform that may strengthen the government institutions post-Ebola. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome Councillor Woods.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. In our career and profession in Liberia, the way we practice law is to be a counselor. It's a different level. I'm still an attorney at law. So I don't want to be under attack for declaring myself otherwise. But in any case, I come to you from Liberia. I've been, and not to scare you, I've been away for more than a month. I left Liberia more than a month now, and I intend to go back over the next 2 weeks en route through Europe. But while here, I have indulged in a determination to mobilize attention and support for Liberia in the face of what I refer to as the Ebola tragedy, but at the same time to focus on long-term issues, as in most cases and in my experience, there has always been focus on the ad hoc in humanitarian intervention without any sense of the long-term sustainable initiative that will build local capacity, strengthen institutions, and drive up the capacity of broken and fragile nations. I will begin with a statement of fact and reality that drowns my heart, because since I left Liberia and prior to my departure, and even as of today, I've received painful reports of the death of friends, relatives who have passed from the virus Ebola. The statement of reality that I want you to leave from here with is that Ebola has no borders. Ebola is a global tragedy that requires decisive and urgent global action. The fact that you've had cases of humanitarian workers and doctors being evacuated from Liberia, treated here in the United States, and now the chilling effect of the development of late in Texas demonstrate how this virus and its impact can transcend religion, can transcend color, race, and every forms of human divisions. We must therefore act together and act swiftly. But we must act within the realm of reason, in the realm of far-sightedness, and in the land of seriousness. I'm happy to be at Emory because having been here more than 10 years ago, my attention was drawn to the fact that Ken and Nancy were flown here to be treated. I hope the inspiration and the motivation which brought both of these individuals here to the United States, and in this place, this state, will be one that will drive you all to collectively act, to build the knowledge, to mobilize the resources, to understand the suffering of people in Liberia, in Guinea, and Sierra Leone, and many places, so that all of us can work and take action and mobilize initiative to change the situation. I will briefly talk to you about the context. Many of you here might know about Liberia, and many of you here might already know about the Ebola virus. I will not try to delve into the health issues because I've learned that you have spoken about that on many occasions. I will try to contextualize my presentation by reflecting and demonstrating how governance, the issue of governance, can play a very pivotal role in driving a process, in ensuring that solutions are found to problems, and in addressing the problems of nation. And after that, we'll discuss some of the actions that were taken locally, actions and responses that are being taken now, and some of the lessons we learned, as well as some of the recommendations I can advance for us to collectively work on the current challenges we face. The Ebola situation was first brought to the attention of the Ministry of Health in Liberia around the late February 2014, when the first suspected individual and case came out of neighboring Guinea into northern Liberia. A few days later, the international organization led by the WHO, the World Health Organization, got involved in trying to examine and investigate what was happening in northern Liberia. It became clear after a lot of investigation that Liberia was confronted with a virus referred to as the Ebola virus, one that had taken place and had been experienced in the Congo back in the 70s. Unfortunately, between March and July, almost about 6 months, the government of Liberia, to a large extent Sierra Leone and other countries, did not take or undertake serious, decisive measures to be able to address the problem. You may ask why, in your understanding, that happened in terms of the governance of the country. Several reasons for that. One, the lack of capacity, the lack of knowledge, sheer poor governance framework and institutions, dilapidated and broken health system, the sense of denial, economic and other cultural issues affected the decision that should have been made by the government. At the level of the civil society and communities, obviously there was lack of knowledge. Certainly there was the issue of increased mistrust and distrust in the government, especially on the Liberian side, based on the historic and the current challenges of the mismanagement of resources, lack of transparency, issues of corruption, and several other issues. So at the civil society level and the community level, hence there was that increased mistrust and distrust as an issue that affected the mobilization of the communities, but also the action of the government in place. And generally, Ebola thrives on the outdated health system, poor governance, and the mistrust due to lack of accountability, transparency. Now, these are the conditions under which we have Ebola to thrive. In addition, you have denial, cultural practices, religious, and I may also add the deficit of leadership. And when I say the deficit of leadership, I'm saying at all levels. At the government level, at the community level, at the level of the religious community, at the level of civil society, everyone, when you talk about the deficit of national leadership, I'm not talking about just the presidency. I don't see the presidency as leadership. I see leadership beyond the presidency. So the deficit of leadership became an issue. What then became the overall response of the government, which I will attempt to then break into segment later on and tell you the impact on governance, the rule of law, paranoia, when authority and power gets paranoid and begin to panic in the face of a crisis. By July 26 this year, the government established a national task force announced by the president, President Sirleaf, that the national task force will be the key mobilizer of actions and awareness around Ebola. It should have been comprised of civil society organizations, including the labor unions, the press union, which is the framework of journalists in Liberia, the Teachers Association, the marketers, and common people represented through their organizations. By the 27th, several actions were taken. the closure of the border. The Liberian border was temporarily closed with neighboring countries. Increased scrutiny at the various airports and ports of entry. New travel policy was adopted. Restriction on public gatherings, and several other actions, including the media and other kinds of sensitization programs. In addition to that, later on, a state of emergency was imposed, invoking provisions of the Constitution, I think Article 86 or so, of the Constitution of the Republic of Liberia. A curfew was imposed by the Liberian government from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. And areas, communities were directed to be quarantined. It is important to note the issue of the state of emergency, curfew, quarantine, and isolation, etc. Because I will return to that in invoking reflections on issues regarding the rule of law, constitutionality of action, and so forth. These were actions taken by the government of Liberia and measures intended basically to begin to address the issues that were raised. On the international front, the international donor community, a lot of international medical institutions, Samaritan Purse, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, and many others began to get involved and mobilize support. The U.S., the German government, USAID, EU, the usual donor community got involved in beginning to mobilize support immediately in terms of fundraising, but also the region, which is comprised of a number of West African countries, as well as African countries, began to hold emergency discussion to begin to address the concern. Now, you will note a number of things. One, I talked about the national level, decision taken at the national level, and action taken. And I mentioned the regional level, action taken at the regional level, and I also mentioned action taken at the international level in terms of responding at those levels. Like the national level, action at the international and regional level was a bit slow, lack of understanding of the issue. But like national governments in Africa, the regional framework is as weak as the very national government that formed them. So hence the challenge at the regional level of evolving a set of decisions and recommendations that will begin to swiftly address the Ebola question was delayed. So at that level, you had those challenges in the country. Now, were there other kinds of indications and impact of the Ebola situation? Yes. The first thing is that the weakness of the governance structure in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea was exposed, clearly exposed. You know, I think some of you know about the famous story of the emperor without clothes. The emperor has no clothes. The emperor was naked. In the face of a major challenge of the Ebola, it exposed the weakness of the system, the fragility of the system. But it's also important to note that within the framework, there are two countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone, that experienced civil war. So you please keep that at the back of your mind. Emerging out of civil war and the challenges of a fragile state that had experience of peacekeeping intervention for years and various kinds of involvement of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and so forth. You have countries now emerging out of war that all of a sudden have been exposed in terms of the great success stories of Liberia and how the World Bank had forgave the debt and how the country was moving forward and all the issues associated with that. It is important to also take note because we also have a discussion on the challenges associated with the indicators and the standards that have been set by the World Bank, by the IMF, and the concept around humanitarian intervention that the world has known And looking back at countries that claim, especially Liberia, that claim to be celebrating 10 years of peace, and yet is being confronted with such a challenge and has failed. Many countries then begin to take interesting decisions. Some countries, they began to ban Liberians, Sierra Leone, and Guineans from traveling. Other countries began to prohibit and restrict flights to Liberia, in and out of Liberia. Those things are being eased as we speak. In the case of Kenya, by the end of this month, a flight will be resuming. But with this situation, a lot of things have compounded. One, caregivers, healthcare workers, relatives on the front line have been the frontliners on this fight against Ebola. Most of them has either died. In the case of Liberia, the most recent report was we had close to about 89 health workers that have died as a result of Ebola. And mass of people have died in the face of that. We're talking about close to 1,900 and more. The number keep climbing in terms of people who have been infected by the disease and have died as a result of the virus. Now, what could be the impact? Already, there has been a neglect for curable diseases. So besides Ebola, we have other kinds of diseases that could be cured, but there have been a neglect. So for instance, malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, diarrhea, HIV, AIDS, and other curable diseases has already been neglected because the health workers feel unprotected. Other sections of health institutions have closed down, and the fact that they have died in large numbers, without incentives, without insurance, with low wages and lack of logistics, it's been difficult for them to remain very aggressive on the front line and in the absence of clear motivation. Now, there has been impact on airlines, for instance, to Liberia. We had close to 11 airlines going to Liberia. At the moment, we have only 2, Air Morocco and the Brussels airline, SN Brussels, are the 2. The third one started flying just about 3 days ago, Air Ivoire from Côte d'Ivoire. The president of Ivory Coast decided to lift the embargo on Liberia. So as a result of that, this happened. This is a country, prior to the Ebola, that had an unemployment level of close to about 70%, and a poverty level of close to 80%. Now, you just look at that picture. In the face of Ebola, you're talking about close to 3.5, 3.6 million people. And in a situation where you had a doctor to about 70,000 people. I mean, this is serious. You know, so if you combine that with the impact on shipping, the impact on investment to the country, the impact on employment, we have a very serious situation. The other thing is that the governance structure of the country, given its fragility, is either in a state of panic for fear that the chilling impact could be instability and chaos. In recent times, attempt to quarantine community has been resisted by protest, and there have been creeping and increasing discontent that has been built over the years and has now begun to build and find itself consolidated within the framework of the current Ebola challenge. So the political stability of the country remain volatile, and hence the security of Liberia and its fledgling democracy. We've had 2 elections, successive elections, is now in retreat. What then does this mean for governance and the decision of the international community to intervene? The first thing is that we need to look at a paradigm shift in terms of the indicators that outline peace. People have seen peace as an event. not as a process. And so getting in there and acting and having an election, getting a president means stability. And peace has been restored without the fundamental institutions to guarantee that democracy will be consolidated. I gave you an example. When I appeared before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia, I raised a number of controversial issues and trying to say that we needed to reassemble the state, to disassemble the Liberian state because it had a false start. And therefore, there was a need to disintegrate the state and reassemble it. And one of the issues I raised was, do we need an army? I mean, why do we need an army in Liberia? Do we really need an army? And it was against the background that the U.S. government had put in $200 million in the restructuring of the Liberian military. I had argued that if that money had been put in health and education, maybe we'll have a different result. Liberians were all being stakeholders in the process, and there will be a different sense of enlightenment and consciousness around the need to collectively drive the nation collectively. $200 million invested in the restructured army. And in recent times, during the period of the state of emergency, one of our community was to be quarantined. The citizens protested. The army shot at them. A 15-year-old boy was killed. Another individual wounded. Liberians began to ask themselves, is this the investment we're talking about? Is this different from the years that the locusts had eaten? And how can we make progress? How can we begin to trust the military? And how can we have confidence in the new army? The investigation on that has not been completed, but it is very clear then that the army itself has not been well positioned, rehabilitated, and restructured enough to even deal with a civilian crisis or civil type crisis. Neither is the government itself in tune with the understanding that the army should be the last resort in terms of the issues. And I come back to the issue when I raised the state of emergency, the curfew, and the issue of quarantine. I have argued that in Liberia we have a very extensive public health law. In the case of the Ebola virus, you must invoke the public health law. There is a public health emergency. Where it is inadequate, probably you have to explain its inadequacy and begin to fill the gap, probably with constitutional issues and other issues. But to rush with haste toward the Constitution and obtain a blanketed state of emergency action that leads to action of such a nature where communities are quarantined without the involvement of health experts, neither the advice, people are isolated, communities are cut off without food, without water, and deprived, where journalists are arrested or newspapers are closed down. Those are fundamental questions when the government of a nation, in the face of crisis, panic, and the state of paranoia evolves. This is where leadership is called upon in the midst of crisis, and leaders must act more soberly than in a haste. And so that is an issue fundamental to the current governance order and the risks that is being imposed by the Ebola crisis. So on the one hand, you will have political actions taken and decisions made in a state of paranoia and panic, but also in a way that could portray that the state of emergency is a pretext for the violation of individual and collective human rights. And those are issues we intend to take up at the regional level and raise some complaints at the ECOWAS court in due course so that such a matter can be duly addressed within the context of the law. 2017 will be presidential elections in Liberia. The process leading to the elections and the framework needed to take into account dealing with the imperial presidency in Liberia. We have something I refer to as the imperial presidency. The all-powerful presidents, central authorities in Liberia, both by the nature of the Constitution. Liberia is what we call a unitary state, not a federal state. And unfortunately, given the nature of a constitution, the president exudes a lot of power and authority in appointing people. When I was in government, one of the things we tried to do in terms of reform was to reduce the number of people that the president will appoint and decentralize it, but also look at the decentralization of resources revenue in the country. That did not work, probably for obvious reasons. But it means that unless we can achieve that, it is difficult to have a president, say, in Liberia that is not as powerful, authoritative, and subject to the dictates and temptation of abuse of the Constitution and the governance order. We also have failed to consolidate the gains on institutions of accountability and transparency, whether it's through procurement, whether it's through anti-corruption institution, whether it's through integrity institutions like the Auditing Commission, and other kinds of institutions. They do exist as a matter of policy and as a matter of frame. But in terms of implementation and enforcement of its recommendations, there have been wholesale impunity. The other issue has to be the unending business of the Truth and Reconciliation process. As a result of the 2003 peace agreement signed in Accra, Ghana, several institutions were to be established. One of them was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the successor institution will be the Independent Human Rights Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed its work more than 3 years ago. Its recommendations have not been implemented. Yes, it did raise issues, it brought out controversy, but that's the nature of a Truth and Reconciliation process. Unfortunately, one of the key issues that people had used to undermine the possible implementation of those recommendations has been the fact that the TRC indicted the president, the sitting president of Liberia, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and disbarred her from participating in political activities for 30 years. That was a major debate, along with other warlords who had been appointed, or at least elected, to serve in the government. So this created the controversy and the difficulty of implementing the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. I still believe that the unended business of the Truth and Reconciliation process needs to continue. Even if we don't fully implement all the recommendations, some of the recommendations are important in addressing the question of peace and moving on with reconciliation, and addressing the issue of impunity. I believe that peace and justice are twin concepts. There can be no peace without justice. I am convinced that unless we can proceed on the path that will hold individuals accountable for the crime against humanity, the wholesale violation of human rights, we will have a vicious circle. Now, that is Liberia, and I still want to, we'll come back to all the recommendations. The international community. As I said, that the essence of consolidating peace has been a big challenge, and the international community, the UN, the United States government, the European Union, the African countries did invest a lot in peace and continue now to get involved. My concern will continue to be that this is not an ad hoc intervention, that a plan in the short term will evolve to address Ebola, In the long term, will evolve to address and upgrade the national health sector of the Republic. But also a plan will evolve to look at the bigger governance question in Liberia and how we can begin to address them. Over the years, you all well know that the world attention has been turned towards the war on terrorism over a long period of time, thereby neglecting other kinds of issues in the region. Although in 2003 I was here in Atlanta, I attended a meeting here with President Carter and with other human rights advocates and lawyers around the world. And one of the issues was a review of the war on terrorism, how it was being waged and its impact on individual countries around the world, that it had become a tool in the hands of dictators to enact new legislation that would victimize human rights lawyers and activists around the world. We made that call in this city in 2003. And interestingly, we're returning, again, probably to the same experience. But when the world turned its eyes in that direction, these fragile nations obviously became victims and were being ignored in terms of building systems of governance, investing in health, investing in education and the infrastructures that goes along with it. The IMF and World Bank has set into motion different kinds of criteria, including no investment in infrastructure in health and certain areas, and they had these limitations, they had these boundaries about how one will make progress. And so, in spite of that, there were millions of dollars spent in Liberia by international organizations, and yet we still have a vacuum, a big gap in terms of where we want to go. It is my expectation that, one, I'm here at Emory, and I know that many of you know too well that a doctor in Liberia was tested with the secret serum from here, one of the doctors, he died. And I'm also at the Center for Ethics. Recently, I raised a fundamental issue that internationally, no call has been made for any medical inquiry as to what led to the death of a poor young Liberian doctor who went to school. He was my junior in school. I knew him well. I have not heard any discussion in that direction. I know we've carried away now with the urgency of the moment and saving lives, but it's important for us to look at how an experimental drug left from the United States, went to Liberia, and, yes, in the case of the Americans, we're told that 2 persons survived, and we don't know the details of why and how, but in the case of Liberia, in the case of the Spanish doctor, they died. I think it is important for us to understand and appreciate the dimension and some of the implications for the future in terms of how we can all collectively at the international level begin to invest and investigate all these challenges. Agriculture has been abandoned because most of the breadbasket, as we call them, areas of Liberia could not engage in subsistence farming. So we expect a lot of issues regarding food and availability and supplies of food in Liberia over the next few months. I need not talk about education. Over the past 3 months, schools have been closed. So we will produce young victims like the victims of war. Again, you know the implications of little kids growing up without an appreciation of the early childhood and benefiting from those things that goes along with an opportunity not only to play, but also to learn. Education has been affected. Obviously, the economy. Ebola represents also a threat to peace and democracy with the governance structure and the near collapse of the state in Liberia and other places. So it's important for the international order and institution to take note of these very important developments along the way. I was reading just a few days ago that we're talking about now more than 3,700 orphans as a result of Ebola. So besides kids who are not in school, we are talking about kids whose parents or relatives have died and have been stigmatized. In communities, people cannot take them in because there's a perception that they have the virus and they could infest other people in the community. And so these are emerging issues. Now let me come to some of the recommendations before I can open up for questions and answers along the way. Firstly, I think we have to try and, with many of you in this room, find a way to destigmatize Ebola. Like HIV/AIDS in the early days in the United States and many other places around the world, you know what was happening to people when it was found out that they were infected by the HIV virus. You could not pronounce it, you couldn't say it. So right now it is happening in our part of the world, in Liberia. People, they deny it. It's not just because people want to deny, but people are afraid that they will be stigmatized. We need to find a strategy to destigmatize Ebola and begin to address it for them. I'm here at Emory, and I hope that we can also muster the resources to be able to help Liberia to reflect and review what might exist as its national health strategy and programs, plan of action, and so forth. That together we can work and muster the resources, the wherewithal, to work with Liberians, the Liberian government, to be able to reflect and review and emerge with an updated, current, and contemporary national health plan, which encapsulates the short, medium, and long-term vision of how we can update, upgrade, and improve our health system in Liberia. The Center for Disease Control is just next door, and I'm sure that they may hear my words. I hope we can also have a Center for Disease Control in our region. And I hope all of you can join me in advocating so that we don't have the director of CDC rushing to Liberia on the trip. We have a virus taking away lives, but that we too can be in the position to be able to anticipate, develop the capacity locally to be able to address the problem. We also need to celebrate local initiatives and efforts on the ground. And many of you in this room, beyond the share of government, need to know that there are local initiatives on the ground. Whether it's the work that the Carter Center and the traditional chiefs are working on to build and create awareness at the community level, to be able to conduct contact tracing and other things. You also have the group that I helped to form just before coming to begin to address the gap and the failure of the government to be able to address some fundamental issue, which is considered the citizen action to stop Ebola, comprising of labor unions, teachers, medical doctors, and you have the health workers, physicians association, lab technician, students and youth and other people trying to fill the gap and reawaken the need for community participation, because I believe the future is the extent of citizen participation to contribute not only to democracy, but to contribute and ensure the legitimacy of any governance structure that comes into place. And I still believe, and I'm convinced, that these kinds of framework can help to drive that process. And we are addressing it both on the horizontal and vertical level. And like I can give some example, in the case of the labor union, we want them to create awareness and to sensitize their constituency of workers, but at the same time look at advocacy issues regarding the extent to which employers are providing protective equipment for the workers, but also the extent to which they are taking note of the labor laws of the country such that workers cannot be exploited. Because there could be wholesale redundancy, abandonment, and neglect of workers. And we need to create a framework so that they know, and we can work along with them to look at the laws and the extent to which they can be protected under the laws of Liberia. And these are areas I believe we can work with. There are 2 doctors in Liberia, Liberian doctors. Dr. Jerry Brown is working out of one of the treatment centers, Dr. Logan. They have begun to use what people may refer to as an orthodox method of trying to get survivors out. And they've been doing some very good job putting out survivors on a difficult situation. They've used some of the counter drugs that you have in America, a drug called selenium, that deals with helping to build the immune system and so forth. I just sent some to Liberia just recently, and I hope I will take some along when I'm going. But they've been trying to do what they can on the ground by trying to look at different options. Dr. Logan have used some antiretroviral drugs for HIV. He believes that if HIV is a virus and you have some drugs that can deal with virus and so forth, he thinks that he could use some of them, and he's been trying to show some results. And I think it's still a tall order which needs some medical inquiry and investigation. But there are local initiatives on the ground which I think we need to energize, celebrate, and support, because the future of Liberia will be built and sustained by its local actors. We need a sustained commitment that will focus on the building of strong health system and institution in Liberia. We need to invest in human capital and resources. We need to invest in education of people. We need to increase private sector and faith-based engagement in helping to expand the health institutions and sectors in Liberia. There's a lot of investment going to Liberia. The Chinese claim that they were investing close to $1.6 billion in one of our mines. How does that translate in the provision of health services? How can we engage private sector investment becomes very critical. We need to find a way to support Liberian professionals who are desirous of returning home to be able to rebuild the country. See how we can, from the continent, and how we can help to be able to support them. I mentioned already civil initiative must be supported. I note very well the commitment of the U.S. government to send in 3,000 troops. I hope that most of them will be health workers and medical practitioners that will begin to reinforce our health system. Liberians too well respect America, but Liberians too well have a sense of army, of the military, and what they can set up to do. I know very well that in this country, the military have trained people in different spheres of professionalism. The ordinary Liberians have seen guns, and they know something different about an army coming in the country. But we know that there's a better term of reference, transparent enough to be able to help to drive the country. But deep in that framework must be an investment that will sustain and strengthen and put in system and institutions in the country. So I must applaud the leadership of the U.S. government on this one. I know that this differs significantly from the Civil War, when there was indifference, complicity, and lack of action in many ways. In this case, we have action. But we want this one to be guided and properly tailored to the needs of the real needs of the region and Liberian people. So I want to repeat again my appeal to Emory University to help Liberia restructure its broken health system and develop an updated and comprehensive health plan and strategy. I want to repeat my call to establish a Center for Disease Control in the region, particularly in Liberia. I hope that the Carter Center will continue the program to focus on the issues of governance, promoting transparency, accountability, the rule of law, and political and social participation. We can work on the immediate health needs of our country. If we don't look at the bigger part of the process, the challenge of governance, we'll be making a sad mistake. So let me take you back to the beginning. Ebola is a global tragedy. It requires urgent, decisive global action. I'd like to thank the Carter Center, my friend Tom, and everyone else at the Carter Center, the Institute for Development, and the Center for Ethics here at Emory University, and to many of you in the audience who I know have come here because of a deep concern and passion for the work that you do, but also the concern for what is happening in Liberia and what is now becoming a global tragedy. I want to thank you very much, and I hope we can have a very fruitful interaction over the next few minutes. Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm sure there might be some questions. Yes.
Thank you for a very challenging and comprehensive talk and vision. And I wanted to go. No, it's not on. I wanted to go back to some parts of the way you referred a few times to the heritage of the civil wars in Liberia and the challenges that I heard some things repeated again in the situation that Liberia is now in. An over-imperial presidency, an over-paranoid, the paranoia of panic. And in previous experiences that the legacy is still, I know, very much alive and struggled with, that has also led to maneuvering of some of the very powerful political figures. You made a few references to them in Liberia, and the manipulation of ethnic differences, tribal differences, the heritage differences in service of that. Is that a danger now, or is the government, in a sense I'm saying, is the government strong enough in relationship to that? Is that a concern for this time in Liberia?
Yes, that is certainly a concern. Those fundamental questions which contributed to the Civil War have not been addressed. As I indicated, the reflection on the Truth and Reconciliation process that attempted to at least discuss and create a framework for dialogue on some of these issues have become unending, or at least have been undermined. And unless we can have an opportunity to have a discussion around these issues and find solutions to them, whether they are ethnic differences. I just listened to some of my friends who just recently formed a political party in Liberia, and they refer to it as the Indigenous People Party, the party that should restore indigenous leadership to Liberia. Whatever that means, I don't know. But again, whatever it reflects, an aspiration of people who should not and cannot be ignored, whatever their views might be. It is an opportunity to have some reflection and a dialogue on moving the country forward. Unfortunately, we thought we had been able to now fill the vacuum and expand the possibility for political participation. We have not been able to do that. And over the past 10 years, we should have invested in that, in building strong political institutions that will form the foundation for our democratic entitlement, in building institutions around the respect for the rule of law. All right? We failed miserably to be able to achieve that. In fact, what has happened is to disintegrate whatever was established. So we're in a state of reverse. And so there's a danger in those things happening. In recent times, for instance, I returned to the country after a meeting, the son of the president, who was chair of the National Oil Company for a long time, announced his intention to contest as one of our local senators of our counties, Montserrat County. Now, I don't want to say, because as a human rights lawyer, obviously I shouldn't be denying anyone of the right to freedom of participation. But there are some moral and ethical dictates in political processes and sacrifices that one must make to be able to achieve our ultimate. Now, in a society where it is perceived that the president and her family, including her son, had accumulated a lot of wealth out of the oil money, to come forward now and to want to contest, obviously, it would certainly raise its own suspicion. There had been suspicion that he wants to be president ultimately, come 2017. You know, that had created a lot of discussion in the political space. My advice, and I have said that many times to my colleagues and many others, is that I will advise even the president against such an attempt. The experience of Egypt with Mubarak and his son, the experience of Senegal, Wade and his son, the experience of Gaddafi and his son. I mean, the list goes on. And why would anyone seek to tread on similar path in history? I mean, you know, so there are just some things that we need to avoid in trying to make the sacrifice to expand the space for political participation and be able to people to overcome the challenges or the suspicion of the political order. So I want to say, in short, those things still exist. We have not been able to overcome them as a country, and we need to work on them moving forward. It's part of the paradigm shift that we need in the society. The other thing I tell people is that most of the time, unlike this society where elections are around issues, we're able to discuss some of the fundamental questions about moving the country forward. We've been stuck in the personality, the cult of personality. That we've not evolved institution, we've evolved personality. And so, if the question is asked around Liberia, you know, the first question is, who do you think can be the next president? Now, I asked someone when they came to see me and was discussing the issue of the presidency, I said, what is your plan? Do you have a plan? We should be discussing the what kind of Liberia we want, how to get there, and the who should be the last. Because the criteria will be set to determine the who. Or the term of reference will be clear for who become president. But we start from the who and develop a messianic view of leadership. And we expect a better result. When this so-called benefactor become a president, we expect that person then to deliver the best result, when in fact we have already created a demigod from the very beginning. You know, so these are some of the challenges that we have to deal with, even in the governance system and the structure, and even in re-evaluating ourselves, those of us who are opinion leaders, you understand, and those of us who are discussing the new Liberia in terms of what kind of Liberia we want. We too need to evaluate ourselves, personally, our role, and reflect very seriously on whether or not we can be involved. I was asked a few years ago to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Liberia. And when I was approached, I made it very clear that I am not qualified to do so. I've been a human rights lawyer in Liberia at work, and I needed to tell my story. I too have been traumatized by the war. I went into exile. You know, I had situations. I was in prison on many occasions. And so I was not qualified to sit and listen to anybody when I was yearning to tell my own story. That would be gross dishonesty. So I told them I opted out not to play that role. And I think it's important for us to look back and reflect seriously on the kinds of role we can play in honesty, given our character, given who we are, and our own limitations.
Professor in African Studies and Women's Studies. So I appreciated, frankly, all the points you made. And so one of my questions is, going on Liz's point, is that Liberia also lives in the world in the context of global issues, development, World Bank, UN. And so we also in the United States, I think, live with a cult of personality. I think we share that problem. And also, I suppose I just wonder, what is possible for Liberia and indeed other countries that might want to go a different route in terms of justice, politics, thinking about society, thinking about the relationship between state and people, traditional authorities, you know what I mean? Is it your point about indicators about peace, I think also relates to indicators that other institutions like the World Bank, like the UN, put on countries saying we need to see indicators in this development, you have to have a law court, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And so I just wonder, what is how possible is it for Liberia to come up with a blueprint for a new Liberia that would really work for Liberia when they work so profoundly have to in the context of a kind of international world economic, you name it, order. You know what I mean? Yeah. Thanks.
You know, I have some very radical views on those kind of things, but you don't let me. The first thing I would say, well, you need to kick the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank, everybody out first. Close down, some of the big corporations. But the fact is that I like to take responsibility first on our own and begin to look at the kinds of things that we can do at our own level, manage the World Bank and IMF and so forth. I just believe that our continuous search for greed and materialism had blurred our passion for service. Our humility and simplicity about this world has been transformed based on our desire for materialism. And I'm saying this in the raw sense. I hope that, for instance, any group of people in Liberia who want to develop a sense of leadership will divest themselves and build consensus on certain values of honesty, of integrity, and that those values should guide us to restore some degree of confidence and hope in our people. What do I mean? Redefining our sense of public service. As a Catholic and a Christian, they say the greatest among you shall be your servant. And I think we have abundance of wealth in Liberia. I mean, I was just in Guinea the other day with the African Development Bank, and we were discussing $20 billion worth of iron ore in Guinea. I mean, why should Guinea be the way it is? Liberia, all the minerals, oil. Why should we be discussing the World Bank and IMF? And why? If we begin to divest ourselves of the, as I refer to it, the elastic taste that never ends, I think we can have a simple leadership, a more slim government, a government that is committed to first look inward at its own resources and be able to ensure that the kinds of disorganized and missed priorities are established. I mean, why should poor government begin to pay lobbyists in the United States, 300 and some more thousand United States dollars to lobby in the United States? If you do good for your people, you don't need to lobby. You need no lobby. But we always seek legitimacy only internationally at the expense of our people, and as a result of that, we will continue to lobby because our people raise the issues. But there will be no need to lobby. You know, we need to cut down on expenditures. One of the challenges I had, and I had to resign, is that just on little things, for instance, purchasing of gasoline. All right? Just gasoline or fuel for your vehicle. Do you know how much the government of Liberia can save? More than close to $10 million. Because I had an example when I was leaving the Ministry of Labor, for instance, I left more than 2,000 gallons of fuel, and these were things that should have been supplied to me. I left more than 7,000 gallons of fuel as Minister of Public Works, directly supplied to me. And we had a policy where I, even as minister, could not use the public vehicle assigned to me outside working hours or weekends or holidays. You know? So why? Why should I be going to play tennis or do something and I'm using the government vehicle to go and do that? When I could walk, I could take a taxi. Simple things like that. We don't take them seriously, but they are things that can make a difference. Because they accumulate into millions of dollars of savings that can help to feed our people. You know? I thought that I made a proposal during the second inauguration that there should be no fun fair. That we need to take the money for any celebration and invest it in a public school or clinic. Those are little things and decisions. A policy on not receiving gifts, for instance. We don't receive gifts. And that was also of the formation of a code of conduct. We now have a code of conduct which I think will be enforced, or we as lawyers will begin to challenge the government to make sure they are enforced. But, you know, gifts, things that, you know, but those are things that dictate that we can do it if we are determined. You know, how many houses do you need, somebody? How many vehicles do you need to ride, for God's sake? So there's a lot that we can do. And so I wouldn't want to even discuss the multinational and so forth for now. That's a whole different issue altogether, or the IMF, but I'm looking at ourselves. The things we can do and take responsibility for, that we can use to redistribute wealth in the country. We can use to send kids to school and invest in properly. We can find our money right within our countries and get the job done and set good examples. You know, so my view is that we need to look inward. We need to get serious about service, especially public service. We need to rededicate and recommit ourselves and redefine public service rather than see it as a center for ill-gotten wealth and a center for exploitation. So it has to be redefined. I think if we do that and look more inward, there can be a lot that can be achieved.
I think you made a compelling case that governance is inextricably tied up surrounding Ebola. And you also spoke that the organization that you work with, the JPC, has been trying to respond to the Ebola crisis. The great reputation the institution has in Liberia has been in the area of civil and human rights. Is the crisis so strong from a standpoint of public health that you've had to temporarily redirect the focus of your programming to the work you're doing in health, or is it still possible to do the rule of law work, and this is an additional branch of the work the JPC is now doing?
Well, yes, it's still possible. There's an additional work because some of the work, I'm still helping as an advisor to the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission. But some of the work they're doing, for instance, with the Carter Center has to do with community, legal representation, paralegal, and other kinds of alternative dispute resolution processes. So that gives the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission and other civil society a better reach and engagement with communities, which then can be a good vehicle to be able to re-energize and redirect the community into better ownership awareness at the community level. So that's an advantage point that is being utilized now to advance the cause. Yes, to some extent, there's impact on the rule of law. Like I was discussing with a colleague of mine, I just did a report with the Advocates for Human Rights out of Minnesota on pretrial detention, for instance, in Liberia as a problem. And we submitted that to the Human Rights Council. But whether that is the preeminent issue now in the public debate, because people are dying, and sometimes it appears being insensitive to the needs on the ground. People are dying, and all we are focusing on these issues. So it is important for a moment to catalog some of those issues while at the same time addressing the current needs and filling in some of the gaps by being more visible in addressing the needs of the people, in mobilizing community into action, and ensuring that we undertake measures that will help to prevent the continued spread of the virus, while at the same time engaging in the kind of advocacy that I mentioned with the labor unions, looking at the labor laws, looking at redundancy issue, looking at the extent to which they are protected in the place of work and so forth. So it's a combination of that. There are other issues we're waiting at the appropriate time to begin to take up because the courts themselves are not as functional as we might want them to be under the circumstances.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments. My name is Georgette Legister. I work with Liz Bounds in ethics. And I was really intrigued by your proposal or recommendation of a regional CDC. If you could say more about that and perhaps how you foresee curbing or managing political relationships so that the same dynamics that have occurred today or in these last few months with the CDC here in Atlanta will not reproduce itself? Do you see the political relationships being an American CDC or a CDC of regional African governments? Can you just say some more about that?
Okay. Well, I am looking more as, I just use the name, the CDC, but it could be a Center for Infectious Disease. It can be a National Institute of whatever it is. But what I'm saying is that we need such an institution in the region, managed by Africans, managed by people in the region. I have colleagues here, some of them completed the University of Liberia with me, who are working at the National Institute of Health here in the U.S. A friend of mine, and he's done very good work in trying to diagnose a number of things, including hepatitis B and C, and so forth, automatic diagnosis of those things. He's been doing a lot of good research on that. So we have some Liberians of proven expertise, Guineans, Sierra Leoneans, and other people who can help to man that. My idea is to have a more sustainable intervention is for these kind of institutions to be in the region, manned by the citizens and people of that region. But you know the words of global village. People exchange expertise, they interact with each other, they do research, and so forth. So one will not just anticipate an exclusive arrangement of researchers, no. But I expect that it will be predominantly managed by the citizens of the region so that we also can begin to anticipate, begin to plan on a regular basis, and begin to foresee some of the challenges we could face along the way. I tell you, my experience, and the experience now has been very terrible. For a long time, we had only 2 testing centers in the whole of Liberia. Far apart, one all the way in the north, the other one. Can you imagine what we are talking about? So people go out for treatment, and it takes more than 48 hours, for testing, before they get the results. People are dying now because the health workers are afraid to touch them, fearing that they are infected. There's no way to test them immediately to have the result in time. so that they can be treated properly for curable diseases. You know, and probably if we have had a structure on the ground and had created centers, then we didn't have the U.S. people going out to put up 17 treatment centers and so forth, that they will be there already. So let's begin to plan, because the example of the Congo has shown that they could reoccur. Are we prepared for that? I mean, although the anticipation is that maybe very soon, given what has happened, contrary to the Congos of the 70s, the spread of it might hasten a vaccine, or might be able to hasten a cure for the Ebola. But whatever it is worth, there could be another strand of it, or there could be another kind of virus that might be developed. So can we plan for it now? Or do we go in for 3 years or 2 years, build treatment centers, train health workers, and leave? And then we say, well, it has been taken care of. We need to think beyond that.
Okay, I think this will allow you to hear me. I hope so. I just want to make a comment on that issue, and that is there is an international organization called the International Association of National Public Health Institutes. The American Secretariat is actually based here at Emory in the Global Health Institute, and I know that they are in conversation with the Ministry of Health in Liberia about setting up something like the CDC, and it's the goal is exactly along the lines that you're talking about, to help countries establish their own public health priorities and their own infrastructures for realizing work in those priorities.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Perhaps we have time for one more question.
I was wondering how you plan. You said that several of your country's health workers were maybe not mistreated, did not have health insurance like we do here. What's the government plan to, or what is your vision to better the healthcare workers in Liberia?
Well, there are a number of discussions now. One, to review their wages and their salaries, to seek improvement in it. There have been some discussion. Prior to the scale of this Ebola, the health workers in Liberia have staged some protests, largely around incentives and other issues. So that protest and that go-slow action persisted as this thing unfolded. We had been in negotiation with them, trying to convince them about the need to continue to work while the discussion around incentives goes on. But the level of death that had affected the health workers created the urgency to begin to look more seriously at incentives, insurance, and other kinds of benefits. They were dying in large numbers. Their families were being neglected and ignored. And we felt it was important now to structure a rare package for them. That discussion is ongoing. It has not been completed. The latest I heard was that it will take close to 10 or more $1 million to be able to structure a real good package for all of them. But that is being developed gradually through phases. But one thing I can say is that those discussions are ongoing. I hope very soon it will be concluded. But the fact remains that they have been poorly paid. The incentives are just terrible. They don't even have transportation. I mean, I talked to the lab technicians, for instance, who are operating one of the centers, the testing centers. And they will stay at work until 3 a.m. in the morning. They will have one vehicle to take them, drop them somewhere, and they walk for miles home. And they're tired already. I mean, these are things that they were subjected to. And I know that there are some improvement. But they are really, I mean, they have to be celebrated as a real frontliners of the fight against this Ebola as we go along. So I think we need to do more.
I'm Gishi Dadul with the Emory Tibet Partnership. Thank you very much for this very insightful deliberation that really enlightened us, gave us a very clear picture of what's going on there, what are the efforts there. In the midst of your deliberation, you did refer to religious hurdles in the way of coming to a decisive resolution. You did touch on the lack of leadership skills as well as lack of moral responsibility that could be expected of the religious leaders. That apart, are there any specific religious practices or religious beliefs that kind of come in the way of addressing this? And from your perspective, what specific roles the religious leaders, be that in the local places as well as those outside of them, could come up with?
Thank you. Yeah, there are specific practices that have led to the spread of the Ebola. For instance, in both our tradition and other religions, we always wash the dead, wash them. And you will be told that a dead person who died from Ebola is even more dangerous than the person who is alive. They say that the virus spread more rapidly from a dead person. So you know what it means, touching or bathing the dead, or even touching the dead during a funeral rites. The other thing is what we call the laying of hands, where people have to lay hands on people to pray for them or to seek healing or so forth. So you lay your hands on touching people, the virus gets transmitted. So I just want to point to those two, but there are several others, including how long we keep our dead and so forth. But the key thing is to be able, and work has been done to mobilize religious leaders to be able to educate the people, the followers, about what this means under the current circumstances in the country. So a lot of people have stopped it. Some had, began to prevent it from happening. And so there's a lot of awareness on the radio. And that's another framework that we have used and we need to continue to use to the vehicle. The radio has become a very powerful tool, especially local community radio station, as a tool, a vehicle for creating awareness in our local languages and so forth. So that has been done. What I am concerned about, and I think Ambassador Gordon and Tom and others might be aware, during the Liberian Civil War, the initial peace plan that was developed by a consortium of religious leaders. The initial peace effort in 1990. And that led to what was referred to as the Interfaith Mediation Committee. It was later transformed into the Interreligious Council. They did a very good job working together, and it has not expanded yet to include a lot of other, but prominent in that group were the Muslim and Christian leaders who came together and worked on negotiating and mediating and helping to advance the cause of peace in Liberia. That group were made out of very prominent leaders, some of whom have died, or some of whom are ill or are very old. I believe the new cream of leadership are not as forceful and as strong to intervene collectively as the predecessors did. So when I talk about the deficit of leadership at all levels, I'm not talking about only that structure, but the moral compass of the society need to be reinvigorated. Because in our parts of the world, people do, no matter where you come from, when a religious leader stands up, you want to defer to him or her in terms of leadership on issues. And I believe if that organization is strengthened, encouraged, reinvigorated, they can play an important role, not only now, but in the future. I used to be involved with them as a technical advisor when I was with the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission, and I know how much we travel around in our search for peace and engage in the different actors and the extent to which they were compelled to respect us. But more than that, they also play a very important role in helping to discourage any attempt or desire by any of the warlords to inject a religious dimension into the conflict in Liberia. By that relationship, they were able to address that kind of concern because prominent leaders of both of the religions were working together and were seen practically working together. So those who wanted to exploit religion, and there were attempts to do so, did not succeed. And I still believe that we still need to consolidate and strengthen that framework because it was that framework that the Guineans in Guinea used as a model to build their own interreligious council. The Ivorians and others were coming to Liberia to appreciate the model that was developed during the war in Liberia. So I think we need to strengthen it. So that's part of my recommendation, that working together in Liberia and outside Liberia, we need to think more seriously on how we can strengthen more interreligious, interfaith dialogue processes that will help our country. Recently, I was speaking on the Congo, on the CAR, the Central African Republic situation, about the same kind of issues and trying to say the need for this kind of religious dialogue and engagement that could help to begin to address some of these conflicts, not only in Liberia but around the world, and also provide the kinds of information that are necessary.
Maybe that's the right time to thank Attorney Woods profoundly for his insights and for his personal energy and integrity around so many different issues in Liberia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.